Hello everyone. Today we're going to be discussing what came before the Big Bang. And if you have paid attention to any of the other videos, you know I don't like the term Big Bang. It wasn't big and it didn't bang. But something did occur, and since everyone knows it as the term the Big Bang, you basically have to use that term or people won't know what you're trying to define or talk about. So when I say the Big Bang, I mean the what caused things to begin functioning. All the way back to the beginning of our universe, our galaxies, and in this case, it's covered in the section of the book, my book, Rationis Physicae, called Theory. Theory is the second section of the book. The first one is Model, where I define orbital fields. I've tried to explain that in my videos. I hope some of you at least have understood those. But something happens before them that leads to them, that leads to the creation of fields. In my model, everything is based on buoyancy, which may sound strange at first. But the function that causes buoyancy to work is displacement. And displacement is merely one particle displacing another particle. And this usually occurs based on size of particles. So large particles will displace smaller particles. And then eventually enough small particles get together and become dense enough that they begin to displace larger particles. And this is buoyancy. Buoyancy affects every system in existence. And if you don't believe that, just stop for a minute, pause the video, and think. What could possibly not be affected by buoyancy? You're sitting on a continental plate right now. It's floating on top of, the surface of the earth. And inside that is a core and a mantle, and it's all buoyant. Science knows this. It's not in question. Look at the sun. They say it's layered, and that as it goes down, pressure builds and starts to fuse atoms. But the layering of the sun is buoyant nature. So the sun is a buoyant system, and the earth is a buoyant system. And think about our atmosphere, the air. It rises, it falls. It's a buoyant system. The water functions here on earth are a buoyant system. And if you look at the earth, right, you can see the buoyant systems. If you look at the sun, you can see the buoyant layering of systems. And it's all based on displacement. The galaxy looks like this when you look at the forces and how it functions. And that's a buoyant system. The universe is an antipole, and inside that it creates this space, this quasi-particle that orbits it, and that's a buoyant system based on displacement. So moons, planets, stars, galaxies, universes, they're all buoyant, and they're all based on displacement. Now, are there other things going on? Perhaps. But they are all buoyant systems. Why is that important? And what does that mean? The theory section of this book breaks down what came before orbital fields. And I call them linear fields. And everything in existence is either a linear field or an orbital field. And linear fields occur when there is no motion between particles. Particles layer on top of each other based on size. And so just really quick, you'd have large particles, and then smaller particles, and then even smaller particles, and then even smaller particles, until eventually you had just tiny, tiny little particles. And since these are larger, I put them at the top of the triangle here. And, these small ones at the very tip, it shows the size difference, but it also represents what I call simplex. So linear fields are defined in simplex as layering of buoyant particles based on displacement. That sounds like a mouthful, but it's really not that big a deal. What it is important, what it's meant to show, is that when I was in school, I had a trick. I would appear to be smarter than I was. And the way I did that is I reversed everything. Let's say there are 50 kids in a class, and the teacher asks a question, and all the kids race forward trying to get to the answer. Well, I did the very opposite. I would think, what is the very opposite of what he's asking? Go to the other side and work backwards. So you had 49 kids all competing with each other, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? And the smartest one of them usually got to the answer first. Here's the thing. Since I started at 100 and worked backwards, and this is just a mental way of thinking about it, then I was as smart, or roughly as smart, as the smartest kid in the room. So we would meet at about 50. So if the answer was in the first 50, I wouldn't get it. But there were 50 kids fighting to get to that answer in the first 50. I worked backwards. So there was only one kid that got, if the answer was in the last 50, that would get it. So it would appear, and it was just a trick, it would appear like I was much smarter than I really am because I would work backwards. And when I started working with physics, that's the same mentality I brought to it. So, what is the Big Bang? What are you trying to explain? Well, trying to explain creation, aren't you? How everything formed. What created where everything came from. The way that we do this is very clear. We take something, and you've heard of it, something the size of an atom exploded in the Big Bang, and everything in existence was created. Not only that, that's impossible, and it's an insane thing to even suggest. But not only that, but 2,000 times as much as what exists was created. And that 999 particles, antimatter, canceled out matter, and all that's left now is what you see. Wow. Just the fact that everything you see couldn't have come from something the size of an atom should dissuade you from that theory. But the fact that it was 2,000 times as much, and that the antimatter, caused the matter to vanish, it's insane. It really is. It's all bullshit. And here's the thing. If we apply my little trick from school and work backwards, let's just start with the very opposite of what they're saying. What would that mean? Well, it means that instead of creation, we're going to deal with deterioration, which at first sounds funny. But let's deal with it. Let's start there. In the deteriorating model, you start with what I call the omega particle, which is everything in existence combined to create one giant particle. So if you want a modern day physics way of explaining that, you would say that a black hole consumes everything in existence. That's it. That's how we get there. And everything in existence then exists within this black hole. And at some point, over some enormous amount of time, All the particles in this black hole, which consumes and has every particle in existence inside of it, the particles lose their momentum and stop moving. So you have an omega particle with everything in existence inside that particle. And those particles have now stopped moving, which is why you have one particle. It has condensed into one giant particle. Everything in existence. Nothing exists outside this particle, period. I understand it would be a huge particle, and it's almost impossible for the human brain to conceive of such a thing. But if you just build a theoretical model in your mind where a black hole continues to consume everything, including space and time and particles, and just everything comes into one particle, and that particle condenses so that there is no motion between the particles that make it up, then it becomes one giant particle. And in my theory, I call that the omega particle. That's it. So we've reached a point where we are the very opposite of what supposedly happened in the Big Bang. But this isn't the Big Bang. This is what happens well before the Big Bang. And this is how it works. I call it theory, the dark side of force, because this is the story of dark matter. This is what we can't see because it's not baryonic. And because it's not baryonic, it has no mass, and it has no gravitational force, and it has no charge. Because the mass and charge in my models come from an antipole structure that's been inverted around a chemtron. Okay, so the omega particle is the largest chemtron, dark matter particle that can exist. It has no field around it because there are no particles outside of it, and there are no particles in motion. So it can have no charge, and it can have no mass, and it can have no gravity. It's just a giant particle. And so the dark side of force really is the story of chemtron structure or dark matter. And this model theory, mechanics, analysis, those are the 4 sections of the book. So it's the story of dark matter from the omega particle that deteriorates. And I understand this is hard to see a little bit. I'll raise it up a little bit. Maybe you can see this, right? This statement here. And this statement you'll see is really one in the middle, zeros on the outside, and ones breaking down as it goes. And I'm not going to continue to hold that up. But what that is the zeros on the outside are nothing outside the omega particle. It's just a numerical way of stating what I'm already saying. And the ones, which you'll see here, if this is the omega particle, and it breaks, right, in time, and I'm not going to argue right now about what causes it. All of the particles in this omega particle coming to a stop, ceasing their motion, could carry a shock wave through the system that breaks it again. Or in time, it could just break. I'm not going to tell you what causes this particle to split. But in time, and the time here, the time here is important because to me the deterioration of chemtron structure or dark matter is what sets the cadence of time. And I know, I'll get to it in a second, I know that what that sounds like, but you'll notice the zeros outside, right? Means nothing exists outside this particle. This is the omega particle. And the ones are simply both sides of a particle when it splits. So the omega particle splits, and when it splits, it creates a space in between the particles. Right? Now we have 2 halves of the omega particle, and in between them, in the crack, is a space, and that space is moving apart. So you have a mechanical way of creating a vacuum in space. you'll notice the space in between these particles is different than the space outside. The space outside is 0, the space inside is -1, and the particles are 1. Well, that's creating a vacuum of space. So as you pull these particles apart, a vacuum is created, and any of the small particles that break down inside this crack will then be pulled inward. They won't radiate outward. So all the particles maintain. And because there's a vacuum, these particles just don't, the two halves of the omega particle don't just split and fall apart. They stay close together. And this is the beginning of the omega particle deteriorating into smaller particles. So when I say my theory is exactly opposite the Big Bang, it's because the Big Bang starts from a tiny particle and explodes into everything in existence. I start the very opposite. I start with one giant particle with everything in existence already existing inside it as dark matter. And that everything that forms comes from the smaller pieces that are deteriorating from that omega particle. So it's actually an intuitive way of understanding. So we have the omega particle. It has split, right? And to me, chemtron structure, dark matter, and the way that it deteriorates is an evolutionary process. And what I mean by that is that, I came to a theory that evolution, the first law of evolution, isn't survival of the fittest. That's the second law of evolution. The first law of evolution is survival of not the fittest, but the one with the most resources. And so you have to ask, where do resources come from? And they come from the system before. So survival of the fittest is secondary to survival of the most resources. So what you really want to do if you want to track evolution is track the resources. Right? And so the resource here is particles. You have one, it splits, it becomes two. And it's the splitting of this over time, right? Time is the deterioration of structure, of dark matter, of chemtron structure. And the way that works, very simply, is, technically, it is the deterioration of structure to the constant of pi. Let me explain. You see here, basically one large particle deteriorating with a split, right? And it looks the same about here, right? Well, what you're looking at there is the visual interpretation of pi. It's a circle with a line through it. And if that is pi, then all you have to do to create a helix is to separate right here the two ends and pull them apart. And this center line lays down. And you end up with a helix above, going up and then back under. And the length of this line is the beginning to the end of where the helix begins. So pi is actually both describing a circle, but it's also describing a helix. And I'm not sure if anyone has ever told you that, because I've never found it anywhere. This is just something that happened in my mind as I was working on this, and I said, wait a minute. You'll notice that T2 this way creates this sphere, this circle. But T2 this way, once this lays down, creates an arrow of time forward. So T2 is this arrow of time outward, and it creates this helix. And you can see I put the quadrants, Q1 phase, Q2 phase, Q3 phase, Q4 phase, which aligns it to the orbital field and, the output, which becomes Maxwell's equations. And time is then the second evolutionary step. You have the omega particle, it splits, and the splitting of this particle, right, is defined by pi. What would that mean? It means simply that the size of the particle decides how long it takes to split. So when you split a particle, right, You then have half and half, only it's not exactly half and half. There's, let's say, 45% of the material on this side and 55% on this side. Well, this one will then split before this one does. And it'll split like 30-60 or 33-66, 1/3, 2/3. And that 1/3 will split again before this one splits in the first time, because time is, through the constant of pi, tied directly to the size of the particle. And the time that it takes for each particle to split is governed and determined by the constant of pi. And that pi can be defined as either a circle with a line through it or a helix with a line through it, where the line lays down and becomes the central core of the helix. So, structure, the omega particle, deteriorates by the constant of pi, which is represented as time. The thing is what comes next is different size particles. So you have one particle, and just think basic geometry. You learned this in 5th grade or 3rd grade, or I don't know when they teach it. But dimensions, you have one particle, it's a dot, a point. You have two particles, it becomes a line. You have three particles, it becomes a plane, well, an angle, whatever you want to call it. So dimensions, right? A point is 0-dimensional, a line is 1-dimensional, right? You build dimensions based on the number of particles. So in an evolutionary way of looking at the deterioration of the omega particle, time splits the particle, and the cadence of time is set by the constant, right, of pi. And what you get is different sized particles splitting at different times, but you get more than one particle then, which leads us to dimensions, right? So the omega particle evolves through time into dimensions. It's pretty simple. And the thing is between those particles, right? So one particle becomes two. You have 0 dimensions. You have one particle, the omega particle. It splits. And between those dimensions, you have space, which is, of course, what we were talking about right here. So, again, the evolution of dark matter of chemtron structure is the deterioration of the omega particle of chemtron structure, dark matter, through the constant of pi, which is time, to create dimensions, right? So the omega particle through the constant of pi evolves into dimensions. And those dimensions move apart slightly, creating space between them, so dimensions evolve into space. It's simple. And space, right? What we're talking about here is smaller particles. When these particles split, even smaller particles, they don't split perfectly. Right? So this splits, but it's like splitting a piece of rock. Little chips fall off. It doesn't split exactly straight. It's crooked. Smaller pieces, bigger pieces, right? It shatters in some spots as it deteriorates. So you get many different sized particles, right, of dark matter, of chemtron structure. There is no forces. There are no charges yet. There is only pieces of different size that fall. Again, there's a vacuum. As you pull it apart, the vacuum of space keeps everything moving inward. And holds the particles together almost like an adhesive. So the particles don't split apart, or there'd be no interactions, and they stay close enough together that all the small particles are in between them, right? All bouncing off each other, right, displacing each other, and that creates buoyancy. Because, and I'll do this here, if you have big particles, right, you'll notice that even if these are touching, and this is touching, and these are touching, there's this space in the middle. So if you have large particles and small particles, the small particles will be able to fall in between the big particles. They can, the big particles will displace the small particles, and that displacement will cause the small particles to move through and around the big particles. So the evolutionary process from the omega particle as it deteriorates through the constant of pi sets the cadence of time, which creates dimensions, which evolves into space, and space full of different sized particles aligning themselves based on size is buoyancy. That's it. So far we have created from a single particle time, dimensions, space, and the result of those things when you combine them is a buoyant system based on displacement. And this is just, again, showing you that everything in the system eventually is based on buoyancy. So buoyancy, if there is a universal law, it's buoyancy. And the force that causes buoyancy is displacement. And displacement is caused by large particles moving small particles out of the way, or small particles becoming so dense that they begin to move large particles out of the way. And that's it. That's the duality of the system. And it's true in every system. The planet, the stars, the galaxies, the universe. There is no system that is not a buoyant system. And the force of buoyancy is displacement. So how does that lead us back to fields, to orbital fields? Well, linear fields are simply the layering of particles based on displacement without motion to each other. It creates a linear field. And linear and orbital fields define everything in existence. There is nothing that cannot be defined by linear or orbital fields. So let's say you're going to talk about anything, but let's do some really easy ones. The wing of a plane is a linear field. As air flows over it, the shape of the wing causes lift. This is a linear field. But you have little engines underneath the wings of this plane, and this cowling around this is an orbital field. So you can see the exact same shape. If you unwrap this, it becomes a linear field. So the lift is actually causing thrust forward because of the orbital shape of the cowling around the engine. So if you take an airplane and you think about it, it is made of orbital fields and linear fields. Right? You've got the fuselage here, the engines here, the wing up above. It's not a very aerodynamic plane, but we'll pass that for now. Right? So you can think of a car. The engine is in a linear frame with an orbital crankshaft that goes to orbital axles connected to orbital wheels. And this, if you lay it out, it's small particles on top of the road to larger and larger and larger particles underneath the road. So look at like the Roman roads or even modern roads. They put big rocks, and they put smaller rocks, and they put even smaller rocks, and then they put some asphalt or which are very small particles or concrete mixed in with slightly larger ones into a flat surface. The road is a linear field, right? So everything can be defined as linear or orbital field. Think about the electricity as it travels down a wire. The wire is round, so you think, oh, it's an orbital field, but it's not. The wire is a linear field, and the orbital field is the length of the wire. So if you have a wire here, it's actually just a charged dipole. You have a certain level of energy here and a much higher or lower energy here, and this is a linear field, and orbital field occurs around it along this linear field. So a wire is a linear field, a road is a linear field, an airplane's wing is a linear field. You are creating in every engineering or physics or any type of structure, you have either linear or orbital fields. And linear fields are layering of particles in buoyancy caused by displacement. That's it. That's linear and orbital fields make up everything. So how do we get to, right, orbital fields from this system? Well, and I'm not sure if I put it here, so I'm going to look through real quick. So when you get to a displacement, right, I prefer this model. Okay, put my pen so I don't lose my spot. What happens after you deteriorate, right? The omega particle, it breaks down through the constant of pi, which sets the cadence of time. So the omega particle evolves into time, which then evolves into dimensions, which evolves into space, which evolves into buoyant layering, right? We have evolved from one giant particle, each step logical, intuitive, and reasonable. This isn't the Big Bang occurred where a tiny particle the size of an atom explodes into 2,000 times of everything we see, and the antiparticles deteriorated the particles until only one out of every 2,000 particles was left, and that's the baryonic matter we see. And I mean, there's just no logic there. There's no reason. It's not intuitive in any way. Whereas if you take one giant particle, you can explain each step evolving from the previous system using the resources created from it to create all the systems that we see. So how would that unfold in this? This is the Big Bang. Only this is how it forms. Eventually, and I've already told you, enough small particles get together that they displace the larger particles, which gives it an elastic, right? If you have a bunch of small particles in an area and a larger particle is pushed in and it displaces it, it then pushes those particles out. And you'll notice an H, I know it's hard to see, but there's an H at the core, 8 pi squared H particles. See the H, right? The reason there's an H is because they're Planck cores. And Planck is the smallest particles that can exist according to science. I'm not going to get into the argument right now, but let's just say they're the smallest particles that can exist that we can see. And so you have these smallest particles that eventually build up enough in a certain area that they begin to displace the larger particles. And when that occurs, then we're right back to orbital fields. One of these chemtron structures, larger particles, gets pushed into this Planck core, gets pushed back out, and when it comes back out, it is baryonic matter. Why? Well, because one of these Planck cores, which, again, I'm not going to get into the size or how they function exactly, but they are antipoles. And that antipole structure inverts, giving it a dipole charge, and that's how dark matter or chemtron structure becomes baryonic matter. And so you have Planck cores, right? The pressure, velocity, whatever of one of these particles gets pushed in. When this particle, these Planck cores as a group, start to gain velocity, start to move together, they create a field around them, just like a giant particle does. So a particle traveling through smaller particles will create a field. I say all fields radiate from a core, and those cores can either be solid cores, solid particles, or they can be smaller particles that have gained displacement. So in this case, they're H cores, Planck cores, that have gained displacement and now have velocity. And they create this field around the Planck core once it has velocity. So this path outward, right? Once it gains velocity, it starts to build the field around it. That field forms from a unitary particle, this Planck core, creating a binary system. And again, right? How does that function? Well, I've showed you before, but I'll do it again real quick. A binary particle, right? Or a unitary particle creates a binary system because it displaces the larger particles in front of it outward, which smaller particles being displaced by the larger particles move inward then. So you have force out, charge in below this in front of it, and you have those big particles then, once the particle passes, the core passes, move back inward, and the energy moves back outward. So you have force in, charge out in front of it, force out, charge in front of it, and force in, charge out behind it. So you have a unitary system creating this binary plane of density, which then give you quad outputs defined by Dirac's equation, if you interpret it using the Cantor-Ternary set as negative, positive, monopole, dipole. So you end up with one or the other, neither and both, 0/3, 1/3, 2/3, and 3/3. And this is the field that forms, right, from a Planck core as it gains velocity. And it forms because, right, de Broglie's standing pilot waves begin orbiting the core like little gears, which then cause this helical path outward. And this helix is defined, again, by pi. Okay? If you split a circle and lay down, right, and pull the ends apart, that center piece of pi lays down and becomes this T2 along the center. So we have everything in existence deteriorating to Planck cores, and the sequence I showed you in the beginning, which is this right here. Oops, I can't see it. Right? This is that same equation. So 1n here is Planck cores. And as those Planck cores gain velocity, it creates a field which causes, like I just said, a dipole to form around some of the chemtron structure, which creates baryonic matter that builds outward. So 2's on either side of the 1n's are baryonic matter. And 2n's is the structure that is formed from baryonic matter. So this entire statement is simply space outside the omega particle. The two halves of the omega particle are the ones that you see here. The 2n's are the largest things that can form from baryonic matter, because as the omega particle breaks down, you get to 1n, which is Planck cores, that then build back outward as baryonic matter. So this is a simple statement once you get it. You may look at it and go, well, that doesn't mean anything, but it really does. It defines everything that happened before the Big Bang. That one simple statement. So we have begun to discuss how the omega particle deteriorates through the constant of pi to set the cadence of time that evolves into dimensions, that then evolves into space, which then, random sized particles in space is what causes buoyancy. Buoyancy is the law until Planck cores form, the smallest particles, gain enough density to have their own displacement, and they begin displacing the larger particles. And when that occurs, you get fields. The structure of fields causes baryonic matter to form. So this is how fields become baryonic matter. And the entire structure, right, 1n, you'll see the H equals 8 pi square. I'm not going to get into the 8 pi square right now, but Planck cores opposite the omega particle, the side, the omega particle splits, and I believe there's things even smaller than Planck cores. We're not going to get into it now, but I call it the subverse. Alpha particles create the core. Then you have the quantiverse, quantum mechanics, atomiverse, universe, megaverse, and infiniverse, all the way up to the omega particle. So I believe that there are magnitudes that we can't see above us, right? Our universe is here. It exists in the megaverse, which exists in the infiniverse, which deteriorates from the omega particle. And the thing is, I can't possibly tell you how many magnitudes there are, right? I built this model, and the thing is, there could be 1 million different magnitudes, and there could be only 3 or 4. I can't possibly know that. I'm not going to guess. I'm only showing you that different magnitudes below Planck cores and above Planck cores all the way to the omega particle. So what I call Planck cores, the particles that make up the cores of 1n, the smallest cores, right? The smallest particles that make up the displacement, they gain density and cause displacement of the larger particles. I call them 1n or alpha particles. So you have omega particle, all things in existence in one particle, and you have alpha particles, the smallest particles that we can test or see. And this is just an idea of how these things form. The thing is this is what leads to mass, right? And it does this because these cores, these tiny, tiny H cores, Planck cores, are actually tiny antipole structures. And I'm not going to get into that today. I keep mentioning it, but it's just too far for today. But those Planck cores, just like hydrogen, right, splits to become a dipole charge around an oxygen to create water, those Planck cores split to become a dipole charge around chemtron structure that gets pushed into the alpha cores and gets pushed back out. And once you have the dipole charge, you gain baryonic matter. And it's the dipole charge in my model that gives mass and charge. So we go into mass, which is caused by the velocity, which leads to the charge. And I call tridynamics, right? Thermodynamics only covers part of what we're talking about, part of the physics required. If you switch to tridynamics, you'll understand the whole thing. So, to me, the entire theory of dark matter starts, again, with the deterioration of the omega particle through the constant of pi, which leads, right, which sets the cadence of time, which leads to dimensions, evolves into dimensions, which evolves into space, which evolves into buoyant structure, which then evolves into fields. And I put this in the beginning of the book, somewhere here, as architecture of reality. And I'm going to read this small bit so that you can, it's everything that I just explained. Clark said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Sorcery is the knowledge of the workings of the machine behind the curtain. Geometry is the system of structure of a measurement. It seems impotent to know the laws of physics and not the reason for the laws. Time is structure, dark matter. The deterioration of structure creates dimensions. Dimensions create space. The layering of particles in space creates buoyancy. Buoyancy causes displacements. Displaced particles are accelerated. Accelerated particles create fields. The structure of fields is the reason for the laws of physics, ratione physicae, which simply means physical reasoning. The name of the book is about the physical reason everything exists. It's physical reasoning. And that's it. That's how creation occurs. This is how, a logical, intuitive, reasonable description of how everything in existence can come about that doesn't involve a Big Bang. It doesn't involve a tiny particle. It doesn't, exploding into everything in existence. We have a reasonable understanding of how, through structures we already understand, black holes, if they just keep building larger and larger and consuming everything around them, eventually everything will be within one black hole. And in time, that black hole will cease all motion of particles in it. And when that occurs, we consider that condensing, and it will condense into one particle. Why is this so important? Well, let's have a little fun. If you have, in modern physics, in modern theory, time is not symmetrical. It's a one-way arrow. Let me explain. If you deteriorate the omega particle and it breaks down and becomes alpha particles, right, which is a bunch of tiny ones, then they condense and become an omega particle, which then breaks down into tiny alpha cores, right? And so on every side of an alpha core, you have an omega particle, and on every side of an omega particle, you have alpha particles. So it is a system that repeats. It can't lose anything because nothing is outside the omega particle. So eventually it all becomes the omega particle again, and then cracks, and then breaks down, which leads to alpha cores, which leads to fields, which leads to baryonic matter, which leads to black holes, which leads to the consumption of everything in existence into one system, which then condenses, which then becomes the omega particle, which then breaks down. And so you get this symmetry to time itself. So when everything becomes the omega particle, right, here or here, all laws of physics, all of the constants that we understand, all of cease. Everything comes to an end, but then begins again once it cracks and begins the evolution of breaking down into alpha cores. And alpha cores consume everything around them like black holes, okay, until there's only everything in one alpha core, which then ceases its motion, which then becomes an omega particle. So time itself is symmetrical in my model. There are no asymmetries anywhere in my systems, in my models, in my theories. And it's such a simple and intuitive, exactly opposite to what they're saying almost. They say one particle becomes creation, right? And this all starts because most scientists, or at least the older ones, were always creationists. They're trying to explain how God or some deity created everything. So it has to be a creative force because that's their God, and their God must exist, and so it must be creative. It's not. It's deteriorative. You deteriorate a particle that then becomes everything in existence. I'm not saying that there is no, God, that there is no creator. I absolutely believe in a creator. Not your gods, but a creator. But it's outside this system, and this system defines a perfect way of defining everything in existence with no asymmetries necessary. This is absolutely, without the slightest reservation, the only way to get where we are without the bullshit, really.